The November fog had settled over Baker Street like a grey shroud, muffling the sounds of London's awakening and casting our familiar sitting room at 221B into an amber twilight despite the morning hour. I sat by the fire, attempting to focus on the morning edition of the Times, while Holmes remained motionless in his leather armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in that peculiar attitude of contemplation I had come to know so well. The gaslight flickered against the yellowed windows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour with mournful persistence. It was precisely then that Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps echoed up our 17 stairs, followed by the unmistakable heavy tread of Inspector Lestrade's boots. "Mr. Holmes," came our landlady's breathless voice. "Inspector Lestrade to see you, sir, and he says it's most urgent indeed." Before Holmes could respond, the door burst open to reveal the compact figure of Scotland Yard's most persistent detective. His usually neat appearance dishevelled, and his face bearing the unmistakable pallor of a man who had witnessed something deeply disturbing. His bowler hat sat askew upon his head, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a leather portfolio to his chest. "Holmes!" Lestrade exclaimed without preamble, his voice cracking with strain. "I've just returned from Surrey, from Ravenwood Mill, and I confess myself completely baffled by what I've discovered there. 3 days ago, the mill owner, Mr. Silas Blackwood, was found dead in his private counting room under circumstances that defy all rational explanation." Holmes' grey eyes flickered with interest, though he maintained his statuesque pose as our visitor continued. "The door was bolted from the inside." "Watson," Lestrade said, acknowledging my presence with a distracted nod. "And the only window is no larger than a hat-box, secured with iron bars and overlooking a 40-foot drop into the mill race below. Yet somehow, impossibly, Blackwood appears to have been murdered, struck down by a blow to the head that could not have been self-inflicted." Holmes finally stirred, unfolding his lean frame from the chair with fluid grace, his keen gaze now fully focused upon our agitated visitor. "The local constabulary found no weapon in the room," Lestrade continued, consulting his notes with shaking fingers. "No sign of struggle, and no means by which an assailant could have entered or departed. The mill workers had all gone home hours before, and the night watchman swears no one passed through the grounds. When Blackwood's clerk found him the next morning, the key was still in the lock on the inside, and the room showed no disturbance save for the body itself." The inspector's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "There's more, Holmes. The safe stood open, its contents gone, yet the combination was known only to Blackwood himself." Holmes approached the window, his silhouette sharp against the grey morning light as he gazed down into the fog-shrouded street below. "Most intriguing," he murmured, his voice carrying that familiar note of satisfaction that invariably accompanied the presentation of a seemingly impossible problem. "Tell me, Lestrade, what manner of man was this Silas Blackwood?" "A hard master," Lestrade replied grimly, "universally despised by his workers and competitors alike. The man had made countless enemies throughout Surrey with his harsh business practices and ruthless ambition. Yet here's the strangest part of all. On the very evening of his death, witnesses report, he seemed unusually agitated, speaking of settling old debts and making amends for past wrongs." Holmes turned from the window, his eyes now blazing with the unmistakable fire of intellectual pursuit, and I knew that once again we would soon find ourselves bound for adventure in the pursuit of an impossible truth. Holmes rose from his chair with that sudden, electric energy I had witnessed countless times before, his grey eyes already blazing with the peculiar fire that seized him whenever an intellectually stimulating puzzle presented itself. "Your account fascinates me, Lestrade," he declared, moving to examine the inspector more closely. "Though I perceive you have omitted certain details, perhaps unconsciously, the faint odor of linseed oil clinging to your coat, combined with the distinctive yellow staining beneath your fingernails, suggests you spent considerable time in the vicinity of machinery recently oiled and maintained. Moreover, the particular pattern of mud upon your boot's clay mixed with what appears to be wood pulp indicates Ravenwood is no ordinary mill, but rather a paper manufactory of substantial size. Lestrade stared in amazement, his mouth opening and closing like that of a landed fish, while I felt once again that familiar surge of admiration for my friend's extraordinary powers of observation. "Pack your medical bag, Watson," Holmes continued without pause, already striding toward his bedroom. "We depart for Surrey within the hour. This locked room mystery presents elements that demand immediate investigation, and I suspect that every moment's delay may prove costly." I set aside my newspaper, recognizing the futility of protest when Holmes had fixed upon a case of such evident complexity, and began gathering the supplies that experience had taught me to keep readily available for our adventures. The journey to Ravenwood Mill carried us through the grey November countryside, where bare branches etched stark patterns against the leaden sky and frost-covered fields stretched endlessly toward distant copses shrouded in mist. Holmes maintained his characteristic silence throughout the train ride. His sharp profile turned toward the window as he absorbed every detail of the passing landscape, while I attempted to draw additional information from Lestrade regarding the peculiar circumstances surrounding Blackwood's death. "The man was found seated at his desk," the inspector explained as our hired carriage wound through narrow lanes bordered by dripping hedgerows, his head resting upon his account ledgers as though he had simply dozed off during his evening calculations. Yet the blow that killed him was delivered with tremendous force to the back of his skull, and there was remarkably little blood, suggesting death was instantaneous. Holmes stirred at this information, his eyes narrowing with interest as he processed what seemed to be contradictory evidence. Ravenwood Mill rose before us like some brooding monument to industrial ambition, its red brick facade darkened by years of soot and weather, while the great water wheel stood motionless beside the swift-running race. The acrid smell of chemicals and pulp hung heavy in the still air, and I could hear the distant rush of water over the weir downstream. Several workers had gathered near the main entrance, their faces bearing the unmistakable expressions of men whose livelihood had died with their master, and they watched our arrival with sullen curiosity mixed with hope that perhaps justice might yet be served. "The counting room lies on the second floor," Lestrade informed us as we approached the imposing entrance, accessible only through Blackwood's private office, which in turn opens directly onto the main mill floor. He was most particular about security, installing the finest locks and maintaining strict control over who might enter his domain. Holmes nodded absently, his keen gaze already cataloguing every detail of our surroundings as we passed through the heavy doors into the cavernous interior. The silence within was oppressive, broken only by the echo of our footsteps on worn wooden floors and the occasional creak of settling timbers. Dust motes danced in pale shafts of light filtering through high windows, while the air carried lingering scents of machine oil and raw materials. Holmes moved with purposeful deliberation, pausing occasionally to examine seemingly insignificant details that escaped both Lestrade's notice and my own comprehension. We climbed a narrow staircase to reach a heavy oak door bearing a brass nameplate with Silas Blackwood's name etched in precise lettering. Lestrade produced a large iron key, his hand trembling slightly as he turned it in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a Spartanly furnished office, dominated by a massive wooden desk, behind which sat an empty chair that seemed to await its master's eternal return. Holmes stepped across the threshold of Blackwood's office with the measured precision I had witnessed countless times before, his keen eyes immediately cataloguing every detail of the Spartanly furnished chamber. The room bore the austere character of its deceased occupant, dark mahogany furnishings polished to mirror brightness, leather-bound ledgers arranged with military precision upon shelves that lined the walls, and a single oil portrait of a stern-faced woman whose disapproving gaze seemed to follow our movements. "His late wife, I observe," Holmes murmured, noting the black ribbon draped across one corner of the frame, though the absence of any personal correspondence or feminine touches suggests their union was more commercial arrangement than matrimonial bliss. Lestrade guided us toward a second door at the far end of the office, this one secured with an even more formidable lock, whose brass surface gleamed, despite the general gloom that pervaded the building. "The counting room," the inspector announced with obvious reluctance, producing yet another key from his collection. "Mind yourselves, gentlemen, we've disturbed nothing since the discovery." The heavy oak door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the mill, revealing a chamber perhaps 12 feet square, its walls lined with metal, filing cabinets, and dominated by a massive desk positioned directly beneath the room's single window. The window itself proved even more restrictive than Lestrade had described, no larger than a gentleman's hat box. Its thick glass reinforced with iron bars that had been set deep into the brick masonry, while the sheer 40-foot drop to the churning mill race below rendered any external approach utterly impossible. Holmes approached the desk, where chalk outlines still marked the precise position in which Silas Blackwood had been discovered, his head resting upon an open ledger whose pages bore neat columns of figures in the deceased man's meticulous handwriting. A dark, irregular stain marred the polished mahogany surface, the wood grain having absorbed the unfortunate man's life essence in a pattern that spoke eloquently to my friend's trained eye. "Observe, Watson," he commanded, kneeling beside the desk with his magnifying glass already in hand. "Remarkably little blood, spatter for such a violent blow, and note the angle of impact from above and slightly behind, suggesting the victim was seated and unaware of his attacker's approach." Moving with systematic precision, Holmes next examined the door through which we had entered, paying particular attention to the heavy iron bolt that had secured the chamber from within. He tested its mechanism repeatedly, his long fingers tracing the metal surface with almost surgical delicacy. "Recently oiled," he observed, lifting his fingertip to catch the pale afternoon light. "Yet see how the oil has run in a thin line along the bolt housing fresh application, perhaps within hours of the crime." His attention then shifted to the threshold itself, where he knelt to examine what appeared to my untrained eye as merely worn floorboards. "Lestrade," Holmes said suddenly, his voice carrying that note of suppressed excitement I had learned to recognize. "You mentioned the key was found inside the lock?" The inspector nodded emphatically, clearly proud of this crucial detail that seemed to render the crime impossible. Holmes produced a small envelope from his waistcoat, and using his penknife tip, carefully extracted what appeared to be a minute fragment of dark thread from a groove beneath the door. "Curious," he murmured, holding the evidence to the light. "Worsted wool, dyed with Prussian blue, expensive fabric, not the sort worn by mill workers." The opened safe commanded his attention next, its steel mouth gaping like some metallic predator caught in the act of feeding. Holmes knelt before the strongbox, examining the dial mechanism with microscopic intensity, while I marveled once again at his ability to discern significance in the most trivial details. "The combination tumblers show recent manipulation," he announced after several moments of concentrated study. "But observe the scratches around the dial, multiple attempts by someone unfamiliar with the proper sequence before achieving success." Rising from his examination, Holmes surveyed the chamber once more, his grey eyes lingering upon details that remained utterly mysterious to both Lestrade and myself. The oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of water rushing over the mill race below, a constant reminder of the impossible nature of the crime we sought to unravel. "We shall require interviews with the clerk who discovered the body and the night watchman," Holmes declared finally. "But first, Inspector, I must examine any rope or cordage kept about the premises for bundling paper reams." Lestrade's puzzled expression at Holmes's request regarding rope and cordage was familiar to me, yet years of witnessing my friend's seemingly eccentric methods had taught the inspector to comply without question. We descended to the mill's storage area, a cramped chamber beneath the main stairwell where coils of hemp rope and binding materials lay arranged with methodical precision. Holmes moved among these supplies with the focused intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts, his magnifying glass revealing secrets hidden within the mundane fibers. He selected a length of waxed flax rope, testing its tensile strength between his hands before raising it to his nose with that peculiar habit of employing all his senses in investigation. "Excellent quality," he murmured, measuring the rope's diameter with a small ruler from his waistcoat, capable of supporting considerable weight without stretching. His attention fixed upon a partially depleted reel, and he turned to address a stocky man in a leather apron who had appeared at our shoulders. "You are the foreman, I presume?" The man nodded nervously. "Caleb Hobbs, sir. These 15 years. Holmes indicated the diminished reel. "This waxed flax someone has taken a considerable length recently." Hobbs swallowed hard, his weathered face growing pale. "Aye, sir. Perhaps 6 feet or more. Taken sometime in the night. I noticed it this morning when preparing the day's bundles." Our examination was interrupted by the approach of hurried footsteps, and presently a thin, nervous gentleman appeared in the doorway, his pale complexion and ink-stained fingers immediately identifying him as the chief clerk. "Inspector Lestrade," he stammered, wringing his hands with obvious anxiety. "I am Edwin Pike, Mr. Blackwood's chief clerk. I was told you wished to speak with me regarding Tuesday evening's terrible events." Holmes straightened from his examination, his keen gaze immediately fixing upon this new witness with predatory intensity, noting the man's crisp blue serge coat and the silver pencil holder protruding from his waistcoat pocket. "Indeed, Mr. Pike," Holmes interjected smoothly, "and I perceive you were the unfortunate individual who discovered your employer's body. The chalk dust upon your sleeve and the particular shade of blue ink staining your right index finger suggest you spent the early morning hours preparing documents before venturing to the counting room." Pike's eyes widened in amazement at this display of deductive reasoning, while his nervous fidgeting increased noticeably under Holmes's penetrating scrutiny. "Yes, sir, precisely correct," the clerk confirmed, his voice trembling with memory. "I arrived at 7 o'clock, as was my custom, prepared the morning correspondence, and then went to deliver the daily reports. When I found the counting room door locked with no response to my knocking, I feared something was amiss." Mr. Blackwood was invariably punctual and never failed to unlock his door by 8 o'clock sharp. Holmes gestured encouragingly for the man to continue, while simultaneously noting details about Pike's appearance that escaped my comprehension entirely. "Had you noticed any change in your employer's behavior during recent days? Any unusual visitors or correspondence?" The clerk's expression grew thoughtful as he considered this crucial question. "Now that you mention it, sir, Mr. Blackwood had been most agitated for nearly a week, receiving several urgent telegrams that seemed to disturb him greatly. He had taken to working unusually late hours, and on Monday evening he received a visitor who seemed to vex him considerably. I heard raised voices from the office before he sent me away with a packet for the post." Our interview was interrupted by the arrival of a grizzled man carrying a lantern, despite the afternoon light streaming through the high windows. "Thomas Briggs," he introduced himself with a respectful touch to his cap, "night watchman these past 20 years. Holmes's eyes brightened with interest as he questioned this crucial witness about his rounds on the fatal evening. "From 10 to 6, sir. Every hour, on the hour gate, yard, wheelhouse, and past Mr. Blackwood's door. But near 2 o'clock, I heard something most peculiar." The old man's gaze lifted toward the rafters above. A humming sound, like a taut string plucked. From somewhere above that office. Strange it was, for there's naught up there but beams and the old iron hoist we no longer use. Holmes's entire demeanor transformed at this revelation, his body tensing with barely contained excitement. "Show me this hoist immediately," he commanded, and Briggs led us to a narrow iron gallery above Blackwood's office. An aged pulley and hook hung from the rafters, apparently long disused and covered with dust and neglect. Yet when Holmes examined the mechanism with his handkerchief, the linen came away bearing a pale, greasy smear of fresh oil. Recently, lubricated, he observed with satisfaction, and observe this scoring on the beam where rope has run under considerable tension. With his penknife, he carefully extracted a minute pellet of dark wax from a crevice beside the pulley housing, conveying it to his pocketbook with the reverence of an archaeologist preserving a priceless artifact. Implications of this discovery sent a thrill of understanding through my friend's keen intellect, and I could see the first threads of solution beginning to weave themselves into a coherent pattern within his extraordinary mind. Holmes remained upon the iron gallery for several long moments, the pellet of dark wax resting in his palm like some ancient talisman whose secrets demanded careful interpretation. The afternoon light, filtered through grimy windows and dancing with motes of mill dust, cast his sharp profile in stark relief against the weathered beams as he conducted his silent calculations. "Watson," he said at length, his voice carrying that peculiar note of controlled excitement I had learned to recognize as the harbinger of significant discovery. "This fragment tells us far more than its modest size might suggest. Observe the striations upon its surface, the distinct pattern of rope weave impressed while the wax was still warm and pliable." Descending, once more, to the counting room, Holmes positioned himself at the precise spot where Blackwood's body had been discovered, his movements deliberate as he traced sightlines from the desk to the narrow window above. The chalk outline upon the mahogany surface seemed to mock our efforts, a silent testament to the impossibility of the crime we sought to unravel. The angle of the fatal blow, the minimal blood spatter, the victim's undisturbed position all suggest death was instantaneous and unexpected, he murmured, producing his tape measure to gauge distances with mathematical precision. Yet the mechanism above tells a different tale entirely. Our examination was interrupted by Pike's nervous cough from the doorway, where the clerk stood wringing his hands with obvious distress. "Mr. Holmes," he ventured hesitantly, "I've been thinking about that packet Mr. Blackwood sent me to post on Monday evening. It was addressed to a Mrs. Agnes Blackwood at Rosemary Cottage in Guildford, his late brother's widow, I believe. The weight of it suggested documents rather than mere correspondence, and Mr. Blackwood seemed most anxious that it reach her without delay." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest at this intelligence, and I observed him make a swift notation in his pocketbook. "Most illuminating, Mr. Pike," Holmes replied, though his attention remained fixed upon the open safe whose steel mouth gaped like some metallic predator caught in the act of feeding. "The combination scratches you mentioned. Lestrade, show me precisely what you observed." The inspector approached the strongbox with renewed purpose, pointing to faint scoring around the dial mechanism. "Multiple attempts. As I said, Holmes, someone unfamiliar with the proper sequence before achieving success." Holmes knelt before the safe, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to our untrained eyes. "Indeed. Yet observe the final sequence executed with confidence and precision. Our thief possessed the correct combination, but chose to disguise this knowledge with deliberate fumbling. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the mill's cavernous interior, followed by voices raised in urgent conversation. Through the narrow window, I observed a well-appointed carriage, drawing to a halt in the cobbled yard, from which emerged a gentleman whose expensive attire and imperious bearing immediately distinguished him from the mill's working population. Pike's face drained of color as he recognized the newcomer. "Mr. Jasper Rook," he whispered with obvious anxiety, "of Ashvale Paperworks. He and Mr. Blackwood were locked in bitter competition over the naval stores contract." Holmes straightened from his examination of the safe, his entire demeanor transforming with barely contained anticipation. "Excellent," he murmured, moving to the window to observe Rook's interaction with the mill workers below. "Note his bearing, Watson, military precision in his condo movements. The particular way he questions the foreman suggests familiarity with industrial processes, a man of method and calculation." The visitor's voice carried clearly through the thin walls as he demanded information about Blackwood's death, his tone suggesting authority accustomed to immediate compliance. "We shall observe Mr. Rook's behavior most carefully," Holmes continued, producing the blue thread he had recovered from beneath the door, though I suspect our true quarry possesses far greater cunning than a mere business rival driven by commercial jealousy. His gaze shifted meaningfully to Pike, whose blue serge coat bore a frayed cuff that matched the evidence with suspicious precision. The clerk seemed to shrink under Holmes's penetrating scrutiny, his nervous fidgeting increasing as understanding dawned that he had become an object of investigation rather than merely a helpful witness. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the counting-room floor as Holmes completed his preliminary examination. His keen intellect, already weaving connections between the physical evidence and the human drama unfolding before us. Yet I recognized the calculating gleam in his eyes that invariably preceded some devastating revelation, and I knew that while he had grasped the essential elements of this ingenious crime, he would reveal them only when the moment served his larger purpose of exposing not merely the method, but the true identity of Silas Blackwood's clever and ruthless murderer. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the counting-room floor as Holmes completed his examination of the blue thread, his calculating mind already weaving connections that remained invisible to the rest of us. Pike's increasing nervousness had not escaped my friend's attention, and I observed him studying the clerk with that peculiar intensity that invariably preceded some devastating revelation. It was at this moment that heavy footsteps echoed through the mill's corridors, followed by a commanding voice that brooked no contradiction from the workers below. Jasper Rook entered the counting room with the bearing of a man accustomed to immediate deference, his silver hair meticulously groomed and his dark overcoat bearing the unmistakable hallmarks of Savile Row tailoring. Perhaps 50 years of age, he possessed the erect posture and clipped movements of military training, while his calculating grey eyes surveyed our small assembly with the practiced assessment of both opportunity and threat. A gold watch chain stretched across his substantial waistcoat, and the diamond pin in his cravat caught the pale afternoon light with brilliant precision. "Inspector Lestrade," he announced in cultured tones that carried an undertone of barely suppressed authority. "I am Jasper Rook of Ashvale Paper Works. This tragic business requires swift resolution, both for justice and for the stability of our industry." His gaze swept over Holmes and myself with obvious recognition. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume. Your reputation precedes you throughout London's commercial circles." Holmes stepped forward with fluid grace, his keen eyes immediately cataloguing every detail of this new player in our unfolding drama. "Mr. Rook," he replied smoothly, "and I perceive you were well acquainted with the late Mr. Blackwood's business methods. The particular shade of blue ink staining your left cuff matches precisely the distinctive formulation used in his correspondence, suggesting recent handling of his documents." Rook glanced down at his sleeve, with apparent surprise, though I detected a momentary tightening around his eyes that suggested Holmes's observation had struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Pike's sharp intake of breath drew our attention back to the clerk, whose face had grown ashen at this exchange. The blue thread evidence seemed to weigh heavily upon his conscience, and under Holmes's penetrating gaze, his composure finally cracked entirely. He stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is something I must confess. On Monday evening, after Mr. Blackwood dismissed me with that packet for Mrs. Agnes, I returned to retrieve my spectacles from the office. I heard voices from the counting room, Mr. Blackwood and another man discussing what sounded like old debts and past grievances." Holmes's grey eyes blazed with satisfaction at this crucial intelligence, while he produced his notebook to record this testimony with meticulous care. "And the nature of this conversation, Mr. Pike?" The clerk wrung his hands with obvious distress. The visitor's voice was cultured, educated, but filled with such venom that it chilled my very soul. They spoke of payments overdue and consequences for broken promises. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes, and then I heard footsteps descending the main staircase. Rook maintained his composure with the practiced ease of a desponders, man accustomed to concealing his thoughts, though his fingers drummed against his watch chain in a rhythm that betrayed inner tension. Blackwood had many enemies. Mr. Holmes, he observed with calculated indifference. His business practices made discretion a necessity and revenge a constant threat. Holmes moved to the filing cabinet nearest the window, where his keen eye had detected something that escaped our notice entirely. Using his penknife, he carefully extracted a fragment of charred paper wedged behind the drawer, evidence of someone's hasty attempt to destroy documents. The partially burned fragment bore the letterhead of a London banking house, with visible notations regarding promissory notes and the initials A.B., clearly legible despite the damage. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, preserving the evidence in his pocketbook. "Someone has been most anxious to eliminate certain financial records, yet their haste has preserved the very information they late sought to destroy." His attention then shifted to the narrow window, where he observed the mill's housekeeper crossing the yard below, her severe black dress and purposeful stride immediately distinguishing her from the mill workers. "Mrs. Channing," Pike identified nervously. "She brings Mr. Blackwood his evening tea and tends to his personal effects." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest as he noted the woman's bearing and the basket of mending she carried. Through his magnifying glass, he observed her work, including what appeared to be repairs to a blue serge garment that matched exactly the thread he had discovered beneath the counting-room door. The pieces of this intricate puzzle were beginning to align in Holmes's extraordinary mind, though he maintained his characteristic reserve while processing the implications of each new revelation. The physical evidence, the wax pellet, the blue thread, the charred financial records combined with Pike's testimony, and the presence of multiple suspects, each with motive and opportunity, created a web of deception that would challenge even his remarkable powers of deduction. As the November twilight deepened around Ravenwood Mill, I sensed that my friend had grasped the essential elements of this ingenious crime. Yet he would reveal them only when the moment served his larger purpose of exposing not merely the method, but the true identity and motive of Silas Blackwood's clever and ruthless murderer. Holmes approached Mrs. Channing with the measured precision that characterized his most productive interrogations, his keen eyes immediately cataloguing the woman's methodical stitching and the distinctive blue serge fabric stretched across her work frame. The housekeeper looked up from her mending with the composed dignity of long service, though I detected a subtle tension in her weathered features that suggested our approach had not gone unnoticed. Her basket contained the usual implements of domestic maintenance: thread, needles, and small scissors. Yet Holmes's attention fixed immediately upon a small cake of dark wax wrapped in linen that rested among her supplies. "Mrs. Channing," Holmes began with deceptive mildness, producing the blue thread he had discovered beneath the counting-room door. "I observe you are mending a garment of precisely the same material and weave as this evidence. A remarkable coincidence, particularly given the circumstances of Mr. Blackwood's death." The housekeeper's needle paused momentarily in its work, though her expression remained carefully neutral as she examined the thread fragment with apparent professional interest. "Mr. Pike tore his coat sleeve on the sorting machinery yesterday morning," she replied with measured precision, her voice carrying the authority of unquestioned competence in domestic matters. "I mend all such garments for the staff as part of my regular duties, Mr. Holmes. There is nothing unusual in such work." Yet Holmes had already noted the defensive quality that had crept into her tone, and his grey eyes sharpened with the predatory focus I had witnessed countless times before. "Indeed," he murmured, examining the wax cake with his magnifying glass. "And this particular preparation designed for waterproofing cordage rather than domestic purposes. Curious supplies for a housekeeper, unless one's duties extend beyond the usual realm of domestic maintenance." Mrs. Channing's composure showed the first hairline crack as Holmes lifted the wax to catch the fading afternoon light, revealing the distinctive resinous composition that matched perfectly with the evidence recovered from the hoist mechanism above. Pike, who had followed our conversation with mounting anxiety, suddenly stepped forward with the desperate urgency of a man whose conscience could no longer bear its burden. "Mr. "Holmes," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "There are matters regarding Mr. Blackwood's recent behavior that you must understand. He had been most agitated these past weeks, receiving urgent correspondence that seemed to disturb him greatly." The clerk's hands shook as he produced a crumpled telegram from his waistcoat pocket. This arrived on Monday morning, and after reading it, Mr. Blackwood became like a man possessed by demons. Holmes accepted the telegram with barely contained satisfaction, his eyes scanning the brief message with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The communication bore the stamp of a Guildford post office and contained only a few terse lines. Final notice. Payment overdue. Consequences imminent. A. B. The initials matched perfectly with those on the charred banking document, creating a pattern of evidence that spoke eloquently to my friend's trained intellect. "Mrs. Agnes Blackwood," Holmes observed, his voice carrying that note of controlled excitement that invariably accompanied significant discovery. "The widow of Silas Blackwood's late brother, if I am not mistaken, and, judging by the urgency of this communication, a woman with considerable leverage over our deceased mill owner." He turned to Pike with renewed intensity. "That packet you posted on Monday evening, describe its contents more precisely." The clerk's face drained of color as he realized the implications of Holmes's questioning. "Legal documents, sir, and what appeared to be a substantial sum in banknotes. Mr. Blackwood seemed most anxious that it reach Mrs. Agnes without delay, speaking of settling old debts and making amends for past wrongs." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He mentioned something about workers' pension contributions that had been irregularly managed. Rook, who had maintained his position near the mill entrance throughout this exchange, moved closer with obvious interest, his calculating eyes betraying a sharp intelligence that had been carefully concealed beneath his commercial facade. "Embezzlement," he stated with cold precision. "A crime that would destroy not only Blackwood's reputation, but the financial stability of every family dependent upon this mill. Mrs. Agnes Blackwood held considerable power over her brother-in-law's fate." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, though I detected the calculating gleam in his gray eyes that suggested this revelation had raised more questions than it answered. The physical evidence, the rope, the wax, the scored beam above, told a story of elaborate mechanical preparation, while the financial motive provided the emotional catalyst that might drive someone to such desperate measures. Yet, the identity of the actual perpetrator remained shrouded in the complex web of relationships and opportunities that surrounded Blackwood's death. Mrs. Channing rose from her work with the dignity of a woman who had served faithfully for decades, her weathered hands folding the blue serge with practiced precision. "Mr. Blackwood was not an easy master," she said quietly, her voice carrying undertones of long-suppressed frustration. "His business methods brought suffering to many honest families, while he lived in comfort built upon their sacrifice." The admission hung in the air like a confession, though Holmes's expression suggested he had expected such a revelation. As the November twilight deepened around Ravenwood Mill, I sensed that my friend had grasped the essential elements of both motive and method, yet he maintained his characteristic reserve while processing the full implications of each new piece of evidence. The stage was set for the final act of this intricate drama, where Holmes would demonstrate once again his extraordinary ability to illuminate truth from the shadows of deception and bring justice to those who believed themselves beyond the reach of earthly law. The November evening settled over Ravenwood Mill like a heavy shroud, transforming the industrial complex into a maze of shadows and whispered secrets where truth and deception prepared for their final confrontation. Holmes stood at the narrow window of the counting room, his sharp profile etched against the dying light as he watched the last mill workers disappear into the gathering dusk, their footsteps echoing hollowly across the cobbled yard before being swallowed by the perpetual murmur of water rushing over the weir below. The gaslight flickered against the yellowed glass, casting dancing patterns across the chalk outline that still marked Blackwood's final position. while the opened safe gaped like some metallic mouth that had devoured its victim's most guarded secrets. "Watson," Holmes announced with sudden decision, turning from his contemplation with that electric energy I had witnessed countless times before. "I believe the moment has arrived for a more direct approach to this fascinating puzzle. The physical evidence, we have gathered the rope, the wax, the blue thread. The charred financial records tells a story of mechanical ingenuity and careful planning. Yet the human element remains obscured behind a veil of calculated misdirection." His grey eyes blazed with the peculiar fire that invariably accompanied his most brilliant deductions, and I recognized the signs of a mind that had grasped not merely the method, but the entire psychological landscape of this ingenious crime. Lestrade, who had maintained his position near the door throughout our extended investigation, stepped forward with obvious curiosity as Holmes began to pace the chamber with measured precision. "What do you propose, Holmes?" the inspector inquired, his voice carrying the respectful attention that years of witnessing my friend's extraordinary methods had instilled. "The case seems to grow more complex with each revelation, and I confess myself uncertain how to proceed against such elaborate deception." "Elementary, my dear Lestrade," Holmes replied, his voice carrying that note of controlled satisfaction that invariably preceded his most audacious strategies. "We shall gather all those directly involved in this unfortunate affair, Mr. Pike, Mrs. Channing, Mr. Rook, and our diligent night watchman, Mr. Briggs, in this very chamber, at precisely 9 o'clock this evening. I shall then present my reconstruction of Tuesday night's events, complete with a demonstration of the mechanism by which this seemingly impossible crime was accomplished." He paused, allowing his words to settle over our small assembly like the mill's perpetual shroud of industrial dust. "However, my initial presentation will contain certain deliberate inaccuracies, carefully chosen to provoke our unknown adversary into revealing themselves through contradiction or nervous reaction." The strategy was quintessentially Holmes, a psychological trap, baited with half-truths and designed to exploit the criminal's need to correct or control the narrative of their carefully planned crime. I had witnessed such tactics before, and they rarely failed to yield the desired result, though they invariably tested the nerves of innocent and guilty alike. Mrs. Channing, who had remained at her mending throughout our discussion, looked up from her work with an expression that mingled resignation with something approaching relief, as though the prospect of final revelation lifted a burden she had carried too long in silence. As the last vestiges of twilight faded beyond the narrow windows, Holmes began his preparations with the methodical precision of a master strategist arranging pieces upon a chessboard. He made subtle alterations to the crime scene, a barely perceptible adjustment to the desk chair's position, a faint dusting of flour along the threshold that would reveal any unauthorized movement, and a careful repositioning of the gas lamp to cast shadows that would enhance the dramatic effect of his coming performance. The waxed rope from our earlier examination lay coiled upon the desk like a serpent, waiting to strike, while the fragment of blue thread rested in a small envelope that Holmes handled with the reverence of an archaeologist preserving a priceless artifact. Pike had departed under the pretext of preparing for the evening's gathering, though his pale complexion and nervous manner suggested little prospect of rest before our appointed confrontation. Rook had withdrawn to the village inn, his calculating demeanor betraying no hint of anxiety despite the mounting evidence that surrounded Blackwood's death like an ever-tightening noose. Only Mrs. Channing remained at her station, her needle moving with mechanical precision through the blue serge fabric, while her weathered features bore the composed dignity of long service, mixed with something deeper, perhaps the quiet satisfaction of one who had witnessed justice. Delayed but not denied, the mill's ancient timbers creaked and settled around us as the November cold crept through every gap and crevice, while the distant sound of water over stone provided a constant reminder of the inexorable passage of time toward our moment of truth. Holmes positioned himself near the iron gallery's entrance, his keen gaze sweeping the chamber one final time as he committed every detail to his extraordinary memory. The stage was set for the unmasking, and I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation that invariably preceded my friend's most brilliant demonstrations. Knowing that within hours, the intricate web of deception would be torn asunder by the sheer force of his relentless logic and the criminal's own inability to resist the compulsion to correct what they perceived as errors in the great detective's reasoning. The mill's ancient clock tower chimed 9 times, each doleful note echoing through the November darkness as our carefully assembled company gathered in the counting room where Silas Blackwood had met his mysterious end. Holmes had positioned each participant with theatrical precision. Lestrade, near the door, with his notebook ready. Pike, standing nervously beside the filing cabinets. Mrs. Channing seated composedly with her mending basket. Rook maintaining his imperious bearing near the opened safe, and old Briggs positioned where he could observe every face in the flickering gaslight. The single gas jet cast dancing shadows across the chalk outline that still marked Blackwood's final position, while the coiled waxed rope lay upon the desk like some serpent waiting to strike. Ladies and gentlemen, Holmes began with the measured cadence of a master performer commanding his stage. I have assembled you here to witness the reconstruction of Tuesday evening's tragic events. His keen gaze swept over each face in turn, cataloging every reaction with scientific precision. The physical evidence tells a fascinating tale of mechanical ingenuity combined with intimate knowledge of both the mill's construction and its owner's rigid habits. He moved to demonstrate the rope mechanism, threading the waxed line through the ancient pulley above, while explaining how a weighted object could be lowered through the narrow window to strike the victim with lethal precision. Yet Holmes's reconstruction contained the deliberate inaccuracies he had promised. Carefully chosen details designed to provoke contradiction from someone who possessed intimate knowledge of the actual events. The timing, I believe, was approximately midnight, he stated with apparent certainty, when the killer released a simple lead weight to deliver the fatal blow. His demonstration drew gasps from the assembled witnesses, though I observed subtle reactions that suggested not all were equally surprised by this revelation of method. The psychological trap was expertly baited, requiring only the criminal's natural compulsion to correct perceived errors in the great detective's reasoning. Pike shifted nervously, his pale complexion growing even more ashen as Holmes continued his deliberately flawed narrative. The door was secured from outside using a thread passed through the keyhole, Holmes declared, indicating the lock mechanism with theatrical precision. No, Pike blurted suddenly, his voice cracking with strain. The thread went under the door. Not through the keyhole, the gap was wide enough, and it was safer. He clapped his hand over his mouth in horror as the words escaped. But the damage was done. The confession hung in the air like an admission of guilt, while Holmes's grey eyes blazed with satisfaction at the success of his stratagem. Mrs. Channing rose from her position with sudden dignity, her weathered features reflecting the inner struggle between loyalty and justice that had tormented her throughout our investigation. "Mr. Pike speaks the truth," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. But he was not alone in this endeavor. The boy came to me in desperation. Knowing what Mr. Blackwood intended to flee with the workers' pension funds rather than face Mrs. Agnes's demands for restitution. Her confession added moral weight to Pike's mechanical expertise, revealing the collaboration between youth and experience that had made this elaborate crime possible. Holmes nodded with the satisfaction of a chess master whose opponent had finally moved into checkmate. "The blue thread from your mending supplies, Mrs. Channing, operated by Mr. Pike's knowledge of the bolt mechanism. The wax pellet to time the release, softened by candle heat to create the precise delay needed. The safe combination known to Pike from his nightly duties, yet disguised with deliberate scratches to suggest unfamiliarity. Each piece of evidence fell into place with inexorable logic, while the two conspirators stood revealed by their own compulsion to correct the great detective's deliberately imperfect reconstruction. The November wind whistled through the mill's ancient timbers as Holmes prepared to deliver his complete explanation of this ingenious crime. where mechanical precision had served the cause of rough justice against a man whose greed had destroyed the lives of honest working families. The stage was set for the final revelation that would illuminate not merely the method, but the profound moral complexity that had driven two unlikely accomplices to commit what they saw not as murder, but as the only means of preventing an even greater injustice from going unpunished. The November wind whistled through the mill's ancient timbers as Holmes stepped forward with the measured precision of a master surgeon preparing to reveal the intricate anatomy of an impossible crime. His grey eyes reflected the gaslight's dancing flames as he began to weave together the complete tapestry of this remarkable conspiracy, his voice carrying that note of controlled satisfaction that invariably accompanied his most brilliant deductions. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his keen gaze sweeping over each assembled face, "we are confronted not merely with murder, but with a crime that masqueraded as the work of supernatural agency, when in truth it represents the tragic collision between mechanical ingenuity and moral desperation." Holmes moved first to address the seemingly impossible circumstance that had baffled Scotland Yard from the beginning. "The bolted door presented our first great obstacle," he explained, kneeling to examine the threshold where his earlier investigation had recovered the crucial blue thread. Yet, Mr. Pike, with his intimate knowledge of this chamber's peculiarities, observed that the gap beneath the door was sufficient for his purposes. Mrs. Channing's strong worsted thread, waxed for flexibility and strength, was passed beneath this door and tied to the key itself. His demonstration was precise and methodical as he showed how the thread could operate the press lock mechanism from outside. Once the conspirators had completed their work within this chamber, the thread was pulled to turn the key, securing the lock from inside. A simple tug then withdrew the thread entirely, leaving only this small fragment caught in the groove, evidence of impossible entry where none had occurred. Rising to his full height, Holmes directed our attention to the ancient hoist mechanism, visible through the chamber's ceiling. The weapon's delivery required both mechanical precision and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, he continued, producing the coiled waxed rope from the desk. The night watchman's testimony of a humming sound at 2 o'clock was not supernatural manifestation, but the song of this rope running under tremendous tension through the recently oiled pulley above. His explanation unfolded with scientific precision as he demonstrated how the murder weapon, Blackwood's own cast iron paperweight, chosen for its symbolic appropriateness, had been suspended above the narrow window on a carefully calculated trajectory. "The true genius," Holmes observed with something approaching admiration, lay in the timing mechanism itself. He produced the small wax pellet from his pocketbook, holding it to catch the gaslight. This fragment, recovered from the hoist mechanism, controlled the entire sequence of events. The paperweight was suspended on a secondary rope, held in position by a knot sealed with this waterproofing wax. A candle, positioned beneath the wax seal, was lit hours before the crime, its flame gradually softening the wax until the knot released at precisely the calculated moment. Pike's shoulders sagged under the weight of confession as Holmes's reconstruction proceeded with inexorable logic. "The telegram from Mrs. Agnes Blackwood was indeed the final warning," the young clerk whispered, his voice barely audible above the mill's perpetual murmur. Mr. Blackwood had already transferred the workers' pension contributions to his personal account and booked passage on the morning ferry to Calais. By dawn on Wednesday, every family in this village would have been destitute. Their life savings vanished with a man they had trusted with their futures. Missus Channing nodded with the dignity of a woman whose conscience had finally found peace through revelation. "I have served this mill for 30 years. She said quietly, her weathered hands folding with composed resignation, watching honest families struggle while that man grew fat on their labor. When young Pike came to me with proof of the theft, we faced a choice between allowing injustice to triumph or taking desperate measures to prevent an even greater crime." Holmes's final explanation integrated every piece of evidence with mathematical precision. The safe combination was known to Pike from his duties, yet he deliberately created scratches around the dial to suggest unfamiliarity, misdirection designed to obscure his access to the stolen funds. The minimal blood spatter and precise angle of impact confirm that Blackwood was struck from above while seated at his desk, completely unaware of the mechanical sword of Damocles suspended above his head. The detective's grey eyes blazed with intellectual satisfaction as each element fell into perfect alignment. The humming sound heard by our watchman was the rope singing as the paperweight dropped through its calculated arc, delivering instant death before being immediately withdrawn by the counterweight system, leaving no weapon and no trace of external entry. Lestrade stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his duty as a representative of the law warring visibly with his sympathy for the moral complexity of the situation. "This remains murder, regardless of the victim's character or intentions," he said heavily, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "The law cannot sanction vigilante justice. No, matter how compelling the circumstances." Yet, even as he spoke these words, his gaze shifted to the opened safe and the scattered documents that bore witness to Blackwood's systematic betrayal of the very families who had depended upon his integrity. Holmes observed this moral struggle with the detached interest of a scientist studying human nature under extreme conditions. "The law must have its course, Inspector," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of philosophical reflection. "Yet remember that motive weighs with sentence as well as with guilt. There is a profound difference between murder for personal gain and the tragic arithmetic of misguided justice." His keen gaze settled upon Pike and Mrs. Channing with something approaching respect. These two individuals saw not murder, but the only means of preventing a crime that would have destroyed dozens of innocent lives. The gaslight flickered against the November darkness as Holmes completed his reconstruction, the coiled rope upon the desk now harmless, a serpent bereft of its venom. Outside, the river hurried past with its eternal, indifferent purpose, while the mill's ancient timbers settled into their perpetual rest. In that bleak chamber where guilt and pity stood side by side, I felt the chill of realities no fire could warm, and I understood once again how my friend could look upon the darkest contrivances of human desperation and read in them not merely crime, but the crooked shadow cast by justice denied and hope destroyed. The silence that followed Holmes's complete reconstruction hung in the counting room like a shroud, broken only by the November wind, rattling the narrow windows and the eternal murmur of water rushing over the mill race below. Pike stood, with his shoulders bowed under the weight of confession, while Mrs. Channing maintained her composed dignity despite the revelation that would surely seal both their fates. The gaslight flickered against the yellowed glass, casting dancing shadows across the chalk outline that still marked Blackwood's final position, a permanent reminder of how swiftly calculated justice could transform into inexorable tragedy. Lestrade moved forward with obvious reluctance, his compact figure squared by duty, yet burdened by the moral complexity that Holmes's reconstruction had revealed. "Edwin Pike, Martha Channing," he began formally, his voice heavy with legal necessity, "I arrest you for the willful murder of Silas Blackwood." The words echoed hollowly in the confined space, while both accused accepted their fate with the resigned dignity of those who had acted according to conscience rather than law. Pike raised his hands without protest, while Mrs. Channing merely folded her mending with the neat precision of a woman completing an inevitable task. "Inspector," Pike said suddenly, his voice gaining strength from moral conviction, "before you take us away, there is something you must know about the funds removed from that safe." He reached into his inner waistcoat with trembling fingers, producing a folded document that bore the official seal of the Guildford and County Bank. "Every penny of the stolen pension money has been deposited into the Ravenwood Workers' Provident Fund. I opened the account at dawn on Wednesday morning, immediately after we completed our terrible work. The receipt shows the full amount, £3,472, now held in trust for the families Mr. Blackwood would have ruined." Holmes accepted the document with something approaching reverence, his keen eyes scanning the precise figures that transformed this crime from mere murder into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. "Remarkable," he murmured, his voice carrying that note of philosophical reflection that invariably accompanied his most challenging cases. "You have committed the perfect crime, not for personal gain. Injustice. The law will see only murder, yet history may judge you more kindly. Mrs. Channing stepped forward with the measured grace of a woman who had spent decades in service to others, her weathered hands clasped before her with composed resignation. "We never intended to become killers, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "When young Pike showed me the evidence of Mr. Blackwood's theft, the falsified pension records, the secret transfers to his personal account, we hoped that shame might yet drive him to restore the funds voluntarily. It was only when we discovered his plans for immediate flight to Calais that we realized desperate measures were required." Rook, who had maintained his position near the opened safe throughout this exchange, moved closer with obvious fascination at the mechanical precision of the crime. "Extraordinary ingenuity," he observed with professional appreciation, though his calculating eyes betrayed a deeper understanding of the commercial implications. "The naval stores contract alone would have been worth thousands annually. Blackwood's death eliminates my primary competitor, though I confess I had not anticipated such dramatic methods of market consolidation." Holmes turned to regard Rook with cold assessment, his grey eyes noting details that escaped the rest of us entirely. "Your presence here tonight, Mr. Rook, suggests more than casual interest in these proceedings. I suspect you were the cultured voice Pike heard arguing with Blackwood on Monday evening, not as conspirator, but as opportunist, pressing him over debts and contracts, while his position grew increasingly desperate." Rook's face flushed, but he maintained his composure with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to concealing uncomfortable truths. The November cold crept through every gap and crevice as Lestrade completed the formal procedures of arrest, his movements mechanical as he struggled with a case where guilt and innocence seemed inextricably intertwined. Pike and Mrs. Channing submitted to their bonds with quiet dignity, understanding that their actions had saved dozens of families from destitution while simultaneously condemning themselves to face the full weight of legal justice. Holmes gathered his evidence with methodical precision, each piece carefully preserved as testimony to the intricate web of motive and method that had produced this remarkable crime. Yet, I observed in his expression a recognition that went beyond mere intellectual satisfaction, an acknowledgement that this case had revealed not merely the mechanics of murder, but the profound moral questions that arise when justice and law find themselves in fundamental opposition, and ordinary people must choose between legal compliance and preventing the destruction of everything they hold dear. The November dawn broke cold and grey over Ravenwood Mill, frost lying upon the cobbled yard, like a shroud, while the great water wheel stood motionless in the crystalline air. Holmes and I watched in solemn silence as Lestrade's constables escorted Pike and Mrs. Channing to the waiting police cart, their breath forming pale clouds in the bitter morning as they walked with the composed dignity of those who had acted according to conscience rather than law. The young clerk's face bore the pallor of sleepless nights, yet his shoulders remained straight with moral conviction, while the housekeeper moved with the measured grace of a woman who had found peace through the revelation of long-harbored secrets. Jasper Rook observed their departure from the mill's entrance, his calculating eyes already assessing the commercial opportunities that Blackwood's death had created, though even his pragmatic nature seemed momentarily subdued by the gravity of what had transpired. He offered Holmes a respectful nod before departing in his well-appointed carriage, no doubt already formulating plans for the acquisition of Ravenwood Mill and its valuable contracts. The building itself seemed to exhale with relief, its ancient timbers settling into their perpetual rest, while the river continued its eternal course, indifferent to the human drama that had played out within its walls. Our journey back to London passed in contemplative silence. The grey countryside, rolling past our carriage window, like scenes from some melancholy drama where justice and mercy had fought their ancient battle to an inconclusive end. Holmes sat motionless in his corner, his sharp profile etched against the pale morning light as he processed the moral complexities that this case had revealed, while I found myself wrestling with questions that extended far beyond the mechanical ingenuity of Pike and Mrs. Channing's remarkable crime. The rhythmic clatter of wheels upon rails provided a hypnotic counterpoint to thoughts that would not be easily resolved by conventional notions of guilt and innocence. 3 weeks later, as London's familiar fog settled over Baker Street like a protective shroud, Holmes received the correspondence that would provide the final chapter to our Surrey adventure. The envelope bore the distinctive seal of Her Majesty's courts, and its contents revealed that justice, in its institutional form, had grappled with the same moral complexities that had challenged our own understanding throughout the investigation. The jury has returned a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder, Holmes announced with evident satisfaction, his grey eyes scanning the formal language that sealed the fate of 2 individuals whose crime had prevented a far greater tragedy. Pike has been sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment, with the possibility of early release for exemplary conduct. While Mrs. Channing, given her age and previous unblemished character, receives 3 years with immediate eligibility for supervised release. He set the letter aside with characteristic precision. The judge's remarks specifically noted the extraordinary circumstances and the defendant's immediate confession, acknowledging that their actions, while inexcusable under law, were motivated by the desire to prevent the financial destruction of dozens of innocent families. The afternoon post brought additional correspondence that provided closure to the various threads our investigation had uncovered. Mrs. Agnes Blackwood's letter, written in a firm feminine hand and bearing the faint scent of lavender, confirmed that she had withdrawn all claims against her brother-in-law's estate upon learning the full extent of his embezzlement. The pension funds rightfully belong to the workers and their families, she wrote with admirable directness, and I have instructed my solicitors to ensure that no legal obstacles prevent their proper distribution. She had also established a modest scholarship fund for the children of mill workers, transforming her personal loss into a lasting benefit for the community that had suffered under Silas Blackwood's avarice. Lestrade's official report provided the final administrative details, noting that the Ravenwood Workers' Provident Fund had been legally recognized and that every penny of the recovered money would reach its intended beneficiaries. The inspector's typically dry prose could not entirely conceal his satisfaction that justice, however unconventionally achieved, had ultimately served the cause of the innocent rather than the guilty. As the fire crackled warmly in our familiar sitting room that evening, I found myself reflecting upon the profound questions this case had raised regarding the nature of justice itself. "Holmes," I ventured, setting aside my medical journal, "I confess myself deeply troubled by the moral complexities we have witnessed. Pike and Mrs. Channing committed murder, yet their actions preserved the financial security of dozens of families who would, otherwise, have faced destitution through no fault of their own." Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, the aromatic smoke curling toward the ceiling as he formulated his response with characteristic precision. "Justice, my dear Watson, is not always synonymous with law. These 2 individuals faced an impossible choice: allow a greater crime to proceed unchallenged or take desperate action to prevent it. They chose the path of rough justice, accepting the personal consequences to protect those who could not protect themselves." He paused, his keen eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The locked room mystery was merely the surface manifestation of a deeper puzzle concerning the nature of moral responsibility when legal remedies prove inadequate to prevent genuine harm. The gaslight flickered against our braingens windows as Holmes rose and moved to his violin case, extracting the instrument with the reverence of a craftsman handling a beloved tool. The mechanism was ingenious. He observed, tuning the strings with practiced precision. Yet the motive was what elevated this crime, from mere murder to something approaching tragic necessity. In the end, we are confronted not with simple questions of guilt and innocence, but with the far more complex challenge of understanding how justice operates when law proves insufficient to protect the innocent from the depredations of the corrupt. He drew the bow across the strings, producing a haunting melody that seemed to capture the melancholy beauty of moral complexity itself. Besides, he added with that characteristic smile that transformed his austere features, the world will supply us with fresher puzzles by morning. I have received a most intriguing communication from a gentleman in Whitechapel whose pocket watch keeps perfect time when placed upon a Bible, yet loses precisely 13 minutes when resting upon a newspaper. If that is not an invitation to intellectual adventure, I know not what is. That observation, Holmes struck a final, crystalline note that hung in the air like a benediction, and the dark case of Ravenwood Mill closed with the quiet finality of a ledger balanced at last. In our comfortable sitting room, where so many mysteries had found their resolution, I understood once again that my friend's genius lay not merely in his ability to solve impossible crimes, but in his capacity to illuminate the profound human truths that transform mere detection into something approaching wisdom. The mechanical puzzle had yielded to his extraordinary powers of deduction, yet the deeper questions of justice and moral responsibility would continue to resonate long after the immediate mystery had been solved, reminding us that the most challenging cases are often those that force us to examine not merely what happened, but whether what happened was right.